We're happy that you ended up joining us today. A little bit on this week's presentation. This is on Chicago's new building code, what you're going to be able to expect, and how Phius has a beautiful tie-in to the Chicago Transformation Code. And our host is Isaac Elnecave. He joined Phius. It seems like he's been with Phius forever based on what has been accomplished already, but he joined in 2019. And he provides advisory services, works closely with submitting CPHCs, provides feedback, and provides answers to questions related to energy modeling and building plans. And prior to Phius, Isaac was a policy manager focused on the adoption of the latest building energy codes and worked as a civil engineer. So his degree is in engineering mechanics from Columbia University School of Engineering and Applied Sciences, as well as a master's in public policy from University of California at Los Angeles. Definitely, we're so lucky to have him on this call and advocating for the Phius standard into the Chicago Building Code. With that, I will pass to Isaac to take over with his slides.
As Curtis mentioned, my name is Isaac Elnecave. I'm on the Phius team here in Chicago, and Chicago is going to be one of the epicenters for energy efficiency and decarbonization. So there's going to be a lot of activity. But today I wanted to go through the Chicago Transformation Code. So as I mentioned before, the city of Chicago is engaging in a fairly aggressive effort to really improve their building stock in terms of energy efficiency and decarbonization. And the Chicago Transformation Code is really one of the first steps. I'll give the very, very brief of what a code is. I'm not going to get into the specifics. This is more about the Chicago Code, not so much code discussion in general. But the basics of energy codes is that it provides the minimum requirement for construction of a building in terms of energy. It serves as the floor. You can go higher than this. You can be more energy efficient than this, but you can't be lower than this. The situation in Chicago and Illinois is a little weird. Illinois itself has a statewide code, but because of peculiarities in the history, Chicago does get to go its own way. And what it really has meant is that you should think about it as there's three levels here of codes in the state of Illinois. There's the statewide code, which is a little bit less stringent than the 2021 IECC model code. And the IECC is the International Energy Conservation Code. There will be the Chicago Transformation Code, which will be more stringent, more energy efficient than the 2021 IECC. And it will include some nice electrification features which are not included in the 2021 model code. Currently, the state is developing its statewide stretch code, but that's not done yet and won't be done until at least the middle of next year. And that code will be more akin to the next round of code. So it'll resemble the 2024 International Energy Conservation Code. That will be the stretch code. But Chicago will have already moved ahead. So the important aspect of this is that Chicago right now in the state of Illinois has the strongest code. So I'm going to briefly describe the improvements in the new Chicago Energy Code. I'm not going to get into all the code issues because among other things, I only have about a half an hour. I'm going to talk about the residential code. We may very well do a similar version for the commercial later on. But I also want to talk about how it relates to Phius. And I think that's the key aspect. I'm going to be very blunt. Part of the work that we do here at Phius is that we really visualize that Phius ultimately the Phius standard should be the energy code, should be the minimum building you build. There are places in the United States, particularly in Massachusetts, where that's becoming true, but that's what we're aiming for. So one of the things I want to really do in this is to somehow place the new Chicago Transformation Code, comparing it to the previous Chicago Code, and then showing how close we are to what a Phius standard building will look like. So I want to really go into some of the major changes in the Chicago Transformation Code from the old one, which was the 2018 or the 2019 version of the Chicago Code. There are going to be significant improvements in the building envelope requirements. There is the inclusion of electrification requirements, and that is really important. That was not included in the 2021 IECC. This was included by the city of Chicago. The city is now also including at least the beginnings of thermal bridging requirements. And if anybody here has worked on Phius structures, we know what thermal bridging is. And if not, thermal bridging is those areas of the building where you lack a certain amount of insulation so that heat flow across a thermal bridge is greater than in areas that are insulated. The traditional example is if you have a stud wall building and you put insulation between the studs, but you leave the studs uninsulated, the studs themselves function as a thermal bridge. And then there is finally the inclusion of alternate compliance paths. And this is really important. We're going to give you a way to build Phius and then have it meet code. Again, this is among the most energy efficient codes in the US. The only ones that I know that are more energy efficient are stretch codes in places like Massachusetts, Washington State, and New York State. But as a baseline code for a jurisdiction, this is one of the better ones. So let's jump into some of the requirements. The first ones I'm going to go through is the ceiling insulation and the basement wall insulation. The ceiling insulation in the old code was R49, and that's the traditional number that's being done. In the new code, the ceiling insulation number is increased to R60. So that's a fairly significant improvement. It's a few, although it's really more or less just a few more inches of cellulose insulation on the ceiling. In other words, it's about 3.5 inches more. And then if you were to go through the Phius prescriptive path, which is what I use as a standard to see what would a Phius building look like in Chicago, a Phius building would require R69. So what you can see is that we're getting very close to what a ceiling insulation in Phius would be. You'd probably need to add another 2.5 inches of insulation to meet it, but it's getting close. So ceiling insulation is now hitting a good spot. Basement wall insulation didn't improve that much. They added an additional R13 plus a possibility of using R13 plus 5 on the basement. And let me explain quickly what 13 plus 5 means. Usually you see R and then a number. That's usually going to be your typical fiberglass bad insulation or cellulose insulation. When they say something like R13 plus 5, the R13 is the bad insulation, and then the 5 is continuous insulation, usually in the exterior of the building. They're saying you can use now R13 plus 5, which is roughly going to be in that range of about R19. And that's what the Phius prescriptive path requires. So at basement wall insulation, we're pretty close. So as you can start seeing, the Chicago code is now beginning to start to resemble a little bit a Phius set of requirements. So let me go to some places where it doesn't. In the window U factor, in other words, basically, by the way, U factor is the inverse of the R value. So if you have an R100 building, that's equal to a U value of 0.1. So it's just the inverse. The code requires a U factor of 0.3, which is reasonable, but it is mostly met by almost every window manufacturer known, and most window manufacturers do significantly better than that. The Phius value, however, which is based not just on energy use, but on comfort and condensation issues, is about half that. And that's usually going to be a triple pane window, while the code requirements are more double pane. So there we do need the code to start stepping up. And I really will say that it should. Most window manufacturers can do much better than 0.30. The window solar heat gain coefficient, which is, just as a reminder, is how much sunlight it allows in. In the old code, they didn't have any specific requirement. In the new code, they've established that you want to do 0.4, but Phius actually says there's no requirement. We want to leave space for people to design their windows to maximize solar heat gain where it matters and to minimize solar heat gain where it doesn't. Here are the two ones where there's a big difference to go. The wall insulation, which is really the most important part of your building envelope because that's the most area. The old one was R20 or R13 plus 5. The new code is significant in that it's now 20 plus 5. So now you're looking at 2x6 construction plus about an inch of exterior insulation. Or if you only do interior insulation, you have to go as high as R30, which is significantly higher than the R20 that was previously there. So the Chicago wall insulation requirements have taken a fairly large step. However, it's still a ways away from the Phius requirement, which would normally require something on the order of about R38. So the old code was R20. It's pushed it to about anywhere from R25 to R30, but the Phius path is going to be R38. That's one of the places where I think we will be looking to improve on insulation requirements. And finally, on the slab, typically in the code, and they didn't really improve it except that they required it to go deeper, it's R10 at 4 feet. Phius requires R19. And this is going to think about R10 and as 2 inches of foam insulation. R19 is going to be closer to 4 inches. So again, on the slab insulation and on the wall insulation, the code still has a little bit of a ways to go. On air and duct leakage, the old Chicago code required roughly a 4 ACH 50 air changes per hour at 50 pascals. The new code pushes it down to 3 air changes per hour at 50 pascals. And I want to emphasize that's not a huge deal. The model code went to 3 air changes per hour at 50 pascals back in 2012. So Chicago's been something of a laggard, and Illinois in general has been something of a laggard on this. The Phius prescriptive path, however, pushes that quite a bit down further to closer to 1 air changes per hour at 50 pascals. So it's about a third of the new code. And I always want to emphasize 2 things. Number one, while it sounds like that's a pretty tough requirement, people meet that requirement all the time, the 1 ACH 50. The second point I want to emphasize is that Phius actually doesn't look at it from an air changes per hour. It looks at it from a airflow across the building envelope. So it looks at from a square footage, the square footage of the walls, the square footage of the ceiling, the square footage of the floor. But as a comparison, it's about a third of the code. The other important aspect of this air sealing requirement, and this is one of the places where Chicago still really does need to do a lot of work, is in the ventilation requirements. And I didn't include the ventilation requirements because the basic point is that Phius requires balanced ventilation, either an energy recovery ventilator or a heat recovery ventilator, while the city of Chicago does not require balanced ventilation. And I know, and I've heard for many years, lots and lots of complaints about the Chicago ventilation requirements. So I don't want to get into them, but I do want to say that you want to make sure that you push down on the air sealing, because that is a very important source of energy savings. But then the city of Chicago also should be thinking about going to requiring balanced ventilation, ERVs or HRVs, simultaneously. But at the moment, Chicago does not, and it keeps its air sealing requirement at what I would call good, but not in any way outstanding. And finally, on duct leakage, where it's required, in case you have ducts, the old requirement was you had to test it if it was outside of conditioned space, outside of the area of the home that's heated and cooled. The new Chicago code, duct testing was required in all cases, even if the duct is outside of conditioned space, which is a much more rational approach. And then that's equivalent to the Phius prescriptive path. Now, obviously, if you have a ductless system or a heat pumps, for example, then that's not required. But the fact that the Chicago code is now requiring testing in all cases is a significant improvement. So let me go now to where it's really a real change in the approach of Chicago, in that there's now what's called a Phius alternate compliance path. Basically, this states that if you build a building to the Phius standard, it is deemed to comply with the code. You don't have to go through all those other aspects of the code that I just went over. You basically, if you have a design certification letter, you can get a permit. And if you can get a final certification, generally within 180 days of the project completion, you get your certificate of occupancy. And that way, if you just focus on doing a Phius project, you'll be deemed compliant with the code. We have that system in a number of places. Like I said, Washington State, Massachusetts, New York, Illinois, in fact, has that system as well, and the city of Denver. And it's a good way of helping practitioners to learn how to build to Phius while maintaining an eye on code compliance. Because if we ever go into a stage where Phius becomes the code, you want to be able to organize and structure your design and construction so that it meets all the Phius requirements, but also can move forward and get your code and meet your code requirements at the same time. So again, if you build a project to Phius standards, it will be deemed to comply with the energy code. The city of Chicago added an additional one that is not usually added in a lot of other places, but they decided to include it here. The National Green Building Standard, the NGBS, is also an alternate compliance path. You must achieve a gold or emerald rating with the NGBS to be deemed to comply, because they wanted to make sure that, because this is a green standard and there's a lot of other features besides energy, you wanted to make sure that it was going to be strong enough so that the energy features would be better than the prescriptive requirements in the code. And it's similar to Phius in that you have to show evidence that the design is eligible for certification at the emerald level to get a permit. And you need written certification that project has achieved that level within 180 days of project completion to get the certificate of occupancy. So those are the two alternate compliance paths. And so here comes some of the other aspects of the Chicago Code that are fairly exciting. Number one, there are electrification-ready requirements. The code does not ban the use of fossil fuels. Some codes do. The state of Washington has more or less banned fossil fuels, but they do require electrification-ready. You need to have the ability to switch your cooking appliances, your clothes dryers, your water heaters, so that you can have an electrified building without having to upgrade your electric circuits. On residential buildings, if you are 3 stories and above, or you have a low slope roof, it has to be solar ready. So 40% of your available roof area must be available to include PV. You have to build it so that it can take the additional solar away from the solar panels. You must have an energy storage system ready area. Now, that doesn't apply to homes and buildings that have a footprint less than 7,500 square feet. So this is going to really apply more to multifamily buildings than single family. Remembering that the Chicago Residential Code is single family and low-rise residential under 4 stories. So if you have a multifamily building under 4 stories and less, it's still covered by the residential code. And the solar ready requirement applies to those that are 3 stories and above and have a footprint greater than 7,500 square feet. And then finally, let me mention some new features that are really not found in a lot of other codes at all. Sometimes you find electrification features in other codes, certainly, but these features are fairly new. Number one, they're asking you to limit thermal bridges in your parapets and balconies, either by including what's called a thermal break or by putting in continuous insulation at these thermal bridges. One example of this would be if you have a multifamily apartments and you have balconies, and this is what this is focusing on, and your balcony is basically one continuous slab from the inside through the wall that incorporates the inside and outside, so that there's, you're heating the floor on the inside and that heat goes out through the balcony, and that's your thermal bridge. They want to make sure that there is a thermal break in there to limit the flow of heat there. That can be a fairly large problem. It prohibits new decorative gas lighting. So if you have new decorative gas lighting, it has to be electric. And again, the EV supply equipment, as I mentioned before. I'm also adding these two because just as a teaser for what the commercial is going to say, a couple of things in the commercial code that are going to be fun and new. Number one, they're requiring grid integrated controls. It means you're going to start requiring having smart thermostats and the like. And if you have indoor plant growing facilities in the city of Chicago, they have to have an energy efficient lighting requirement, because as you can imagine, for many of these plant growing facilities, the amount of energy used in lighting can be very significant. So that's a quick overview of what's going on with the new Chicago Transformation Code, and I'm happy to take any and all questions.
Thanks, Isaac. Very good overview and a nice comparison to how the Chicago Code in its current form is changing as well, and Phius being an alternate path of compliance there. We did have a bunch of questions coming in on the chat, and I'm going to start with one from on behalf of Janet. And Janet, you're welcome to unmute to refine this question. However, the question is, she would love to see this translated into non-technical terms. For example, a general percentage comparison of energy savings against the conventional build that it is today to a percent anticipated energy savings in the new Chicago Transformation Code. And then,
so my background, to give this a little context, my background is a little unusual for this group, but it in part goes deep into science and technology journalism. But in all of this that I've heard, one of the things that really matter to people is, if I do all of this, am I going to save 30% off my energy bill?
So you've given me a very deceptively simple question, because as the code has evolved, there are certain aspects which don't compare easily. But that said, you can expect a new home with the Chicago Transformation Code to be about 10% more efficient than the 2018. But I will tell you, that's really, if you go back to when we really started doing the code, and that's really in 2006, which is our baseline code. And the code typically is updated every 3 years. You're looking at about a 40% improvement since the 2006 code.
So as a journalist, that's your lead. I'm in the midst, I have a 1942 home that I'm slowly but surely making ready for the 2040s. And that leap that you just said, because most building stock is older, so there's going to be a lot of retrofit going on here. It's just dramatic.
Yeah. And I want to add, and the reason I'm trying to be a little careful on that is because this code has incorporated electrification-ready and solar roof ready. In other words, it's not just improving energy, it's starting the process of decarbonization. And that's not you can't put a energy savings necessarily on that, but what it's doing is that it's saying that building now under the Chicago Code are going to be much easier to decarbonize in the future. And I will tell you, Janet, that the issue of retrofits is a much broader issue. This is really focusing on new buildings, but I will be happy to talk with you offline about retrofits, which is a whole other can of worms. But it is a significant improvement. And I want to say that the other aspect that I want to emphasize is that Illinois, the state of Illinois as a policy, is trying to head to net zero, having net zero codes by around 2030, which is to say, a net zero, by the way, means a building where the renewable energy, where the PV panels produce enough electricity and produce enough energy to counter the amount of energy you would be using in your house. So basically, you limit your energy use, and then whatever is left over is met by the PV. So what we're doing here is not just improving the energy efficiency of the code, but we're setting it up so that we can start doing these net zero homes ultimately. But also, I want to emphasize that this is a code that's helping to start the process of decarbonization.
So Isaac, I think it's great that we're talking about how this transformation code is really a stepping stone to build that foundation to a net zero future. And one of those stepping stones or that infrastructure is the solar ready roof requirement in larger buildings. And Lisa had a question here about the solar ready roof requirement being required in larger buildings can sometimes not be as beneficial due to so many drains and air handling units on that rooftop, particularly in over 7-story buildings. So can you comment on the solar ready requirements, where it's best suited and where it might not be?
Sure. I want to emphasize that the solar ready roof requirement includes a number of caveats, and I didn't include the exceptions, but they do exist. But the first part of it is that you're only required to use 40% of the available roof area. If you need to use more, then that would be that problem. Oh, and before I start, this is for 3 stories and 4 stories only. There is a commercial section which will require solar ready roofs, and that does incorporate the 7-story buildings. But for the residential here, it's for 3 and 4 stories. So they will note that if there are obstructions, that has to be taken into account, like tree cover, for example. And you can only use 40% of the available roof area, because you do need to have space for heating and cooling units, for ventilation units, and other aspects. They do incorporate a fair number of exceptions as part of this. I would be happy to talk with you again offline about what the specifics are.
And Isaac, this is Lisa. This is all set in stone now, right? There's
It's
no
in-
opportunity to comment or, because
This
I
was
did
the-
try in the past to participate, but
Oh, they made it.
they never answer emails or phone calls.
No, this was passed in September, and it's in effect.
Okay, thank you.
I just had a question about gaining access to the code requirements. Is Chicago planning to publish it through the IECC or the ICC's website? Then that's where you're downloading this and you're getting this information. I'm on their website now and it's very vague with what's available.
You can get this through the city of Chicago right now. The city of Chicago does this in an odd way, and that's obviously completely unsurprising. They do this by ordinance. So there is, in fact, there's a city of Chicago ordinance, 2022-2008, and that's the ordinance number. And that's going to actually include all of these requirements in the code. I think ultimately the International Code Council will, in fact, publish the new code because they have published them in the past. But if you want to look at them now, just go to the city of Chicago, go to that ordinance, and the ordinance itself will give you these requirements.
That's okay.
I'll send it to you. Gabriel.
Thank you.
So Isaac, this isn't necessarily a policy question, so I'm not sure if this is going to be for you, but I'm going to open it up to some of the architects on the call here as well, because Beth had a question regarding thermal bridging in context of a parapet wall. If using continuous insulation and there's not a thermal break, would you need to insulate the top of the parapet and down the backside to fully wrap that insulation so you have a continuous insulation?
I have to see. I think I better not specifically answer. My feeling is that yes, you should, but I'm not going to say for certain because that's going to be a question for the city of Chicago. Go ahead.
Yeah, and related to that, Paul had the question that asks, is the city going to be enforcing the energy code now with inspections? Because his experience and some of our other experiences in the past is they have not. And that kind of goes along with how are we measuring air sealing, and are blower door tests required, or are there other ways that is measured upon inspection? So I guess a little bit more on enforcing this code in the future.
Oh boy.
Insight to that.
Okay, that's a complete other webinar. The answer is that yes, they're still going to have the same general approach, which is they're going to want to have people, particularly for the commercial code, that they're going to want a registered architects or registered engineers stamp. Technically, they are required to do a blower door test on all projects. That is in the code because that is part of the 2021 IECC. And remember, the Chicago Transformation Code is the 2021 IECC enhanced. So they're not taking stuff out. So the requirement is for them to do blower door. Are they going to enforce it? I believe that they are going to try to beef up their enforcement. I don't have a good sense yet on whether they will, what the coverage will be at this point. One of the things that I think they're hoping for whatever it's worth, is that they're hoping that the Phius alternative compliance path will help them out, because if you do the Phius alternative compliance path, then the city is effectively does not have to enforce the code. So one of the things that I think they're hoping for is that this will spur more Phius projects so they don't have to do a lot of the specific enforcement. However, on things like air sealing, they are required to do a blower door test. I think part of the work that we have to do going forward is working with the city to figure out how to improve their enforcement, again, through things like alternative compliance paths, and how to figure out how to get more funding and more resources to the city. But unfortunately, there's not a good answer to that.
It's nice to see that Phius is actually a solution to this in this whole code. So fantastic in that respect, at least. Christopher had a comment here as well that, Christopher, I'd like to open the mic to you if you'd like to make that comment on ICC's plans to publish.
So the full text of the code is not available as a combined text yet. So what you have in the ordinance is just the amendments and changes that were done to the model code. So you have to do a comparison as you're going through it, because the ICC won't publish this version of it probably till the end of December or early January. That's the interim situation right now.
Yeah, you would have to go through the IECC 2021 and then look through the ordinance, and the ordinance will tell you specifically where the changes occurred. But that's one of the reasons I highlighted those changes.
Isaac, you said you didn't want to talk about ventilation rates, but could you talk about ventilation rates a little bit?
No, and I would actually defer a little bit to Chris on this. On the residential rates, it's going to be the 2021 IECC ventilation rates. And the electrical efficiency of the ventilation is going to be based on the 2021 IECC rates as well. Basically, it's basically the 2021 rates, which are not that different from the Phius rates, but I think there's not much else to say about it. The ventilation rates for the commercial rates is obviously a whole other can of worms, and that we don't have time to get into, but it's the 2021 IECC ventilation rates.
A few more comments in the chat. Thank you again to Janet on how we can reframe this so that it is more attractive to people, policymakers, and advocates. But just wanted to open up real quick if there's any final questions before we wrap up. Really grateful for everyone's participation today. This is an exciting development. Thanks a lot for everyone's participation, and big thanks to Isaac once again for breaking this whole thing down for us with the exciting Chicago transformation code for buildings.